Burning the Gavle Goat is a game. Alright, this is going to involve me saying the name of a Swedish town, and I'm very confident that I'm not going to get it quite right. I've watched some different pronunciation guides, and I've tried my best, but the way I'm landing on this one is Gavle, which, that's how it's written, and the term used for this goat is the Gavlebocken, I think. I'm going to try to avoid using that word because I'm also very confident I'm not going to use it well, but please understand, I'm not trying to be disrespectful, I'm just familiar with my boundaries. You're not already aware of this story, probably because Tom Scott told you about it about 5 years ago. The Gavle Goat is a large straw goat built in the town of Gavle in Sweden. Gavle is not a large town, though Cube Analytics, while I was working on this video, did try and tell me, it's the Chicago of Sweden, which means nothing to me as someone who doesn't go to Chicago either. Gavle has a tradition where in Christmas season every year, they build on a metal frame a large goat out of straw. It's a very cute goat. It's a nice kind of sit in a public square, everyone looks at it, take a picture with the goat kind of thing. And for most of its lifetime, as a tradition, that goat gets burnt down. Just to be clear, this isn't a fun, goofy game in the context of the people burning the goat down. If you go and burn down the Gavle goat, you will be probably arrested and fined, and they may even confiscate your cigarette lighter, a thing that's happened. But the people who want to burn the goat are doing so in often some very playful ways, including shooting flaming bow and arrow at it. As technology has advanced, surveillance has advanced, and now you can live stream the cameras around the Gavle Goat. Of course, those cameras can also be hit with denial of service attacks. During the COVID lockdown, the goat was also surrounded by a perimeter to try and ensure that anyone who did come and look at the Gavle Goat was not likely to be coming into close contact with one another, and there were still attempts to burn the goat down. This isn't meant to be a comprehensive history of how the Gavle Goat survives or doesn't survive. You could just go check the Wikipedia page like I would anyway. But the live stream footage is a thing I've wanted to talk about for a while now, because chances are, if you're tuning in to watch the Gavle Goat live stream, in the hopes of catching the moment when someone successfully puts it on fire, or with the deep-seated hope that maybe it'll survive this year, you are playing a game. I'm going to reach over and grab the extremely tediously well-worn copy I have of Man Playin' Games to once again bring up all-purpose French jerk and clown hater Roger Caillois. Caillois wrote in the 50s, building on the work of Johann Huizinga, about the idea of games and the engagement surfaces people had with it. I've talked about him quite a lot, and I've talked about him more this year. If you want to go check out my video on I Was a Teenage Exocolonist, I go a bit more in depth there. But in his idea of modalities of play, he considers one of the ways that people engage with games is the aliatic. That is to say, games of chance. Caillois' model of considering games wanted to look not at what the game was functionally doing, not a specific manipulation of parts or an interface of particular components, but the mood and disposition of the people playing it. Aliatic games are often simplified as games of chance. The typical example that comes up in the book, and therefore people providing excerpts from the book, is poker is a game with a competitive element, the agonic, but also the aliatic, this random chance. And Caillois had a very, really quite pagan view of things, a very spiritualist vision of this, in which, to some extent or another, he kind of thought that we just liked going into a casino as a sort of temple and lighting some money on fire in the name of God, but that's still a game. Now, the conversation around gambling as a type of gameplay is a strange one, because Caillois also argues that a game has to be non-productive. It can't produce anything of value. I would argue money has some value. So the question becomes, is the money part of the game? Is the money a component in that game? And all of this is what I think of as white guy game studies. There's a lineage that stretches pretty much Johann Huizinga to Roger Calois to Bernard Suits, probably then to Ian Bogost. And these are not bad books. I'm not wild about flow, and that's probably tied to the fact that I'm definitely not going to try and pronounce the author's name here, but still, these books exist in a space which treats games as isolated and separated from all experience, and therefore the realities of day-to-day life are melted away in a vision of the magic circle. And then you have another different thread of game studies, which looks at games in terms of not necessarily the centered dominant group. Every time I talk about Calois, I will take a chance to point out that this guy was really quite racist. His arguments about the colonial nature of the world were derived from games. He genuinely seemed to forward a position that because Europeans played games like poker and chess, they were obviously going to take over the world because their games made them better at taking over the world. The destiny of a civilization is written in its games. And then he would go on to describe how games from quote-unquote Africa were about men donning snake masks, taking drugs, and imagining themselves as gods, which, I forward, this means no one invited him to any cool parties. Calois' model and treatment of this idea of the magic circle and as if a game is sacrosanct from life is directly at odds with a vision of games that I see instead in the work of C.L.R. James, a Trinidadian journalist and Marxist? Don't quote me on that one. He'd be more clear about it in his book Beyond a Boundary. Beyond a Boundary is about cricket. And no, Americans, the joke you're about to make about how hard cricket is to understand, and I'd like to suggest, before you make it, shut up. The book is about the way that as a person of colour interacting with cricket, the game of the empire, there was a layer of politics in all forms of play James dealt with growing up in the West Indies, and that the nature of who you are related to how you were allowed to play. The way he phrases it is, cricket had plunged me into politics long before I was aware of it. When I did turn to politics, I did not have too much to learn. Beyond a Boundary is a great book, and even if you're the kind of person who's intimidated by play-by-plays of actual cricket games, just get a copy and read the opening couple of chapters about just what it's like growing up in the space of an empire's game, and how the nature of racist players mean that the game can never be truly disconnected from real life. I said it earlier this year, the magic circle is a kind of privilege. But okay, I didn't just bring up this whole idea of C.L.R. James and Roger Calois so that I could point out, je suis so raciste, I mess up my own thesis. But rather because these games and these visions of games are always grappling with the idea of where the game and life intersect. Calois thought that watching a roulette wheel was a game, but that the money you got out of the game if you won was somehow non-productive, non-creative. This vision of what you do in the game is therefore somehow a non-creative action, whilst James talked about the way that you could create political identity and represent that identity through the playing of your own games. These are ideas that are big and teetering and somewhat top-heavy, easy to fall too hard into one model and not reflect on that these are ultimately ways of describing phenomena that exist that we don't necessarily have a way of boiling down out of chemistry in the real world. When you watch the live stream of the Gavle Goat, you have, hypothetically, an investment in how the game goes, but you don't know. The outcome is unpredictable. Someone is probably going to commit a crime, and we are watching our state in how that works out. It is an Asiatic game in the same way as roulette is, in the same way as bingo is. You don't have a lot of control, but you're still there, valuing this thing that has no connection to your life. You are choosing to feel that way. This is play. This is remote play, and this is play which doesn't require you to have any pieces. Even if you're not watching the live stream, You may have an opinion about whether or not the goat should be burned. You may have types of ways the goat get burned that you have opinions on, as it were, good plays. I think the Gavle Goat is a really wonderful and very weird tradition, and not just because I'm generally in favor of extremely funny crimes, but I think that the question of how I, a person in Australia, care about a little tradition in a Swedish town that doesn't care about me, because I'm not going to go to Gavle. I don't have the tourist dollars to spend there. They stream it anyway, and I get to partake in this game. It helps to erode the barriers on what we think of as a real game and what counts. Thing is, you can make a game out of anything.